She thought him a nobody, a man with mud on his boots and nothing in his purse, unworthy of so much as a civil word. She would learn, on a morning bright with trumpets, gathered lords, and the full pomp of the British Empire, that the nobody she had scorned wore, beneath his laborer's coat, the blood of dukes and the weight of 11,000 acres. What happens when pride meets destiny in the age of ballrooms, secret letters, and a longing too proud to speak its own name? Stay with me, because this is the story of a man who hid his crown to find his heart, a woman who nearly lost everything to vanity, and the quiet governess who taught a duke that love does not trouble itself with titles. Yorkshire, in the year 1861, kept its own private weather. It was a gray, patient rain that did not so much fall as linger, settling over the moor above the village of Ashcombe like a shawl thrown carelessly across old furniture.
I'm so sorry, Mr.
The
Gray.
kind of rain
Please
that
take
seemed
this.
less like weather and more like a mood the sky had simply decided to keep. It was the kind of rain the London papers never troubled to describe, because London did not believe the North possessed weather worth the ink, being far too occupied with its own fogs and its own fashions to spare a thought for a county it regarded, at the best of times, as somewhere one's ancestors had once owned land. It was precisely this rain, indifferent and endless, that soaked through the coat of a man standing on the scaffolding above the rising east wing of Ravenshire Hall, directing his masons with the quiet, unhurried authority of someone who had commanded far greater things than a building crew, and who had found, to his own private and rather uncomfortable astonishment, that he preferred this small, muddy, unglamorous kingdom to the whole of the one he had inherited. He called himself, on the estate books he kept for his own private amusement, Mr. Gray. He was, in every particular that mattered to the wider world, His Grace Alistair Vane, 7th Duke of Ravenshire, master of 11,000 acres of Yorkshire moor and dale, patron of 2 hospitals and a foundling home in Leeds. Holder of a seat in the House of Lords, he attended with dutiful reluctance and left at the first respectable opportunity, and, as the London papers were fond of reminding their readers each season with tiresome regularity, the most eligible bachelor north of the Thames. He had inherited the dukedom at 26, upon the sudden death of his father from a seizure of the heart, in a room too grand and too cold for a man to die in alone, and had spent the 4 years since discovering, slowly and with considerable private bitterness, that a title was less a crown than a kind of elegant imprisonment, a cage built of good manners and expectant faces, from which there was no honest escape. Everyone bowed to him. Everyone smiled at him with a warmth calibrated precisely to his income. No one, he had come slowly and painfully to believe, truly looked at him, not the way one looks at a person, only the way one looks at a very fine piece of property one hopes to acquire. At Almack's the previous season, he had watched, with the detached horror of a man observing a natural disaster from a safe distance, no fewer than 7 young ladies rearrange the whole of their personalities within a single quadrille to better suit what they imagined a duchess ought to be, laughing at jests he had not made, professing sudden and violent passions for pursuits he had never once mentioned, agreeing with opinions he had not yet formed, until he could no longer tell where any one of them ended, and the imagined shape of Duchess of Ravenshire began. Their mothers watched from the edges of the ballroom with the calculating patience of falconers releasing a bird toward a particularly promising piece of game, and their fathers spoke to him of dowries and settlements and the excellent hunting to be had on their estates, before they had troubled themselves to learn whether he preferred tea to coffee, or silence to conversation, or solitude to a crowded room. By the close of that season, he had begun to feel less like a man than like a very handsome annuity, walking about on 2 legs for the general convenience and entertainment of the ton. It was this weariness, this particular aristocratic loneliness, that no amount of silk or supper or string quartets could cure, a loneliness made all the more absurd by the fact that he was never, in the practical sense, alone, that had driven him, some months past, to the peculiar habit of visiting his own estate improvements incognito, dressed in the plain gray wool of a foreman, boots muddied like any laboring man's, simply to remember what it felt like to be regarded, for even an hour, as a man and not a fortune. It was on such an afternoon, having sent his carriage ahead to wait discreetly at the crossroads a mile distant, and walk the remainder into Ashcombe with mud climbing steadily to his knees, that he pushed open the door of Whitmore's provision house, seeking nothing grander than a cup of tea and a quarter-hour's shelter from a rain that showed no inclination whatsoever of relenting. The bell above the door rang thin and small, swallowed almost at once by the drumming of rain on the shop's low roof. Behind the counter, arranging ribbons with a great deal more attention than the task strictly required, stood Miss Cordelia Ashworth Vane. No relation whatsoever to the ducal Vanes, a coincidence of surname she had found, since arriving in Yorkshire the previous autumn, alternately amusing and cruelly ironic, given how very far she now felt from anything resembling a dukedom, a ballroom, or indeed her own former life. Cordelia was 22, dark-haired, striking rather than merely pretty, with a fine straight nose and a mouth made for either laughter or scorn, depending entirely upon her circumstances, and possessed of the particular brittle certainty that afflicts young women who have been raised to expect a great deal from life and have recently, through no particular fault of their own, been given a great deal less. She had come to Ashcombe under conditions she preferred not to discuss with anyone, least of all herself, a broken engagement to Mr. Frederick Hollis, second son of a minor baronet, who had cried off with unseemly haste upon discovering that Cordelia's own father's fortune had been considerably and permanently diminished by a bad investment in Argentine railway bonds that had seemed, at the time, an unimpeachably safe wager. London society, with its long memory for scandal and its notoriously short mercy for the fallen, had made the remainder of that season entirely unbearable. The sly smiles, the sudden discovery by former friends that their dance cards were quite full, the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room, and Cordelia's aunt in Yorkshire, proprietress of Whitmore's provision house and possessor of a small spare room above the shop, had seemed, at the time, the only refuge available to a young woman with a wounded name and a still more grievously wounded pride. She had never forgiven Yorkshire for existing. She had certainly never forgiven herself for standing behind a shop counter, folding ribbon for farmers' wives, and measuring flour for the vicar's cook, when she had been raised, however precariously, however much that upbringing had since proved to rest on borrowed money and overextended credit, to imagine herself the future mistress of a fine London townhouse, with a carriage of her own and a name in the society pages that meant something other than pity. And so she had resolved, with the fierce and slightly unhinged logic peculiar to the recently and publicly humiliated, that she would marry up, and marry grandly, or she would not marry at all, that she would never again be caught unawares by circumstance, as her father's foolishness had caught her, and that she would, from this day forward, extend her good opinion, her smiles, her warmth, her attention, only to those who could demonstrably afford the investment. She looked up as the bell rang, and her lovely mouth arranged itself, almost without her willing it, into an expression of faint and thoroughly practiced distaste. A laborer, mud to the knee, his dark hair plastered flat against his forehead by the rain, a coat of coarse gray wool marking him plainly, to her practiced eye, as a man who worked with his hands for wages rather than commanded others to work for him, precisely the sort of man she had trained herself, since her arrival, to look through rather than at, as though he were no more than a piece of poorly placed furniture. He removed his cap as he entered, a small courtesy that entirely escaped her notice, as such courtesies from such men always did, and said, in a voice unexpectedly low, unexpectedly even, entirely lacking the broad Yorkshire vowels she had learned, with some effort, to associate with the county's laboring men. "A cup of tea, if you would be so good, and perhaps a few minutes by your fire. The rain has rather got the better of me today, I'm afraid." Cordelia did not move from behind the counter. "This is a provision shop," she said, in a voice pitched to carry to the two other customers examining bolts of cloth by the window. "Not a public house. We do not serve tea to men who intend to track half the moor across a floor my aunt scrubbed with her own hands this very morning." "I should be glad to wipe my boots at the door," said Mr. Gray, with the unhurried patience of a man who had, in fact, once addressed a room of 200 anxious tenant farmers during a bad harvest year, without once raising his voice above a conversational pitch, and who had no intention whatsoever of beginning to shout now, in a shop, over so small a thing as a cup of tea. "I do not ask for charity, madam. I am glad to pay whatever you ask." "You should be glad to leave," Cordelia returned, with a small, satisfied lift of her chin, and there came, from the two customers by the window, a soft ripple of amusement that pleased her rather more than it strictly ought to have, given that it was purchased at the cost of another person's dignity. He did not leave. He stood, quietly dripping onto the worn boards, water pooling faintly at his feet, and asked once more, without heat, without the faintest edge of injured pride, in the manner of a man entirely unaccustomed to being denied, but equally unaccustomed to demanding, whether she might spare him a cup of tea and a quarter-hour's warmth, as the rain showed no sign whatsoever of relenting, and he had walked some considerable distance already, with more distance yet to go before dark. It was precisely this, his maddening, unshakable calm, his flat refusal to be baited into either apology or anger, his apparent immunity to the small cruelty she had already, in her own mind, begun to enjoy, that undid the very last of Cordelia's patience. She came around the counter with the swift decisiveness of a woman who has found, at long last, an entirely acceptable target for a temper that had been simmering, unspent, for the better part of a year, seized a jug of water intended for the shop's flower arrangements sitting upon the windowsill, and threw its contents full into his face, before the whole of the shop, before God and the two ladies at the window, and her own horrified aunt, who had just that moment emerged from the back room to witness the entire scene. "There," she said, breathing hard, two spots of high color blooming vividly on her cheeks, which she mistook, in the heat and thrill of the moment, for righteous dignity rather than what it truly was, the first small tremor of a shame that had not yet caught up with her. "Perhaps that will teach you to trouble your betters with your impudence, and to know your place in future." The shop had gone entirely silent, save for the steady drip of water from the stranger's chin onto his already sodden coat, a small and terrible sound in the stillness. He did not wipe it away. He only looked at her, not with the anger she might, in some perverse and unexamined part of herself, have found almost satisfying, something she could push against and call justified, but with something far more disquieting, a grave, sorrowful curiosity, as though he were quietly cataloguing her, filing her away for some later, private accounting she could not begin to imagine and would have been considerably alarmed to learn of. Then a second voice broke the silence of the shop, quiet but entirely unmistakable in its authority. "Cordelia, that is quite enough." The speaker was a young woman who had been arranging bolts of India cotton near the far window, and who now crossed the shop floor with unhurried purpose. Her steps neither rushed nor hesitant, plainly dressed in gray poplin with a small white collar, her chestnut hair pinned simply beneath a modest cap, her eyes a clear, level gray-green that seemed, even in that brief crossing of the room, to take in a very great deal while betraying almost nothing of what she thought of it. She reached beneath the counter without a word, drew out a clean linen cloth kept for wiping the glass jars of preserves, and held it out to the stranger without a trace of the disgust Cordelia had shown, and indeed without any particular ceremony at all, as though offering a dry cloth to a wet stranger were simply the most natural and unremarkable thing in the world, requiring no great courage or virtue to perform. "Forgive her, sir," she said, quietly enough that it did not carry much beyond the counter. "It was unkindly done, and I am ashamed of it on her behalf, since she seems entirely disinclined to be ashamed of it herself. Please, sit by the fire and dry yourself properly before you catch your death. I'll bring you tea directly, and no charge for it." He took the cloth. Their eyes met for the length of perhaps 3 seconds, hers steady, unashamed, entirely unimpressed by the fact that he was, by any measure a shop assistant might reasonably apply to a stranger's coat and boots, a man of no particular consequence whatsoever, and something in his chest, long dormant beneath the accumulated weight of bows and calculations and Almack's quadrilles, turned over quietly, like a key finding, at last, and after a very long search, its proper lock. "You are very good," he said. "May I know your name?" "Eleanor Hartley," she said, already reaching for the kettle that sat warming by the small backroom fire. "I keep the shop accounts for Mr. Whitmore, my aunt's cousin, and I teach the vicar's younger children of an afternoon, when he can spare me from the ledgers." "Eleanor Hartley," he repeated, as though testing the shape of the words against something in his memory that had not yet earned the right to hold a name so plainly, unaccountably precious. "I am obliged to you, Miss Hartley. Rather more than a cup of tea can properly repay, I think, though I shall certainly enjoy the tea as a beginning." She did not smile at this, exactly, but something in her expression softened, a small crack of warmth in an otherwise composed and careful face, as she went to prepare the tea. Cordelia, meanwhile, had retreated behind the counter once more, arms folded, watching the whole exchange with a curled lip, entirely certain that Eleanor's kindness to a common laborer reflected rather poorly on Eleanor's own judgment, and not at all on her own conduct. He did not stay above 20 minutes. He drank his tea slowly, warming his hands around the cup, thanked Eleanor again with a gravity that seemed, to Cordelia watching sourly from behind the ribbon counter, entirely disproportionate to so small a kindness, and went back out into the rain with his cap pulled low against the weather. Cordelia watched him go, with her chin still lifted, entirely satisfied with the morning's small triumph, already composing in her mind the amusing story she would tell that evening at supper, entirely unaware that she had just humiliated, before 11 witnesses and her own disapproving aunt, the man who owned not only the roof over her aunt's shop, but very nearly every roof for 11 miles in every direction, and whose good opinion, had she known its true value, she would have crawled across the wet floor to secure. If you're enjoying this one so far, do me a favor and hit that like button, drop a comment below telling me what you think of Cordelia so far, and subscribe if you haven't already. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. Now, back to Yorkshire. News in a village the size of Ashcombe travels with a speed that would shame the new telegraph lines London so prided itself upon, and by the following market day the tale of the shop girl who doused a laborer had grown so thoroughly in the telling that the original jug of water had, in some tellings, become an entire pail, and the laborer's supposed impudence had grown to encompass everything from insolent staring to outright insult, though not a single witness could recall him having said anything at all beyond a request for tea. Cordelia told the story herself, gaily, at every opportunity that presented itself, at church, at market, over the vicar's wife's parlor tea, as evidence of her own wit and discernment, always ending with some variation of, "You should have seen his face," quite drowned, and served him entirely right for his cheek, while Eleanor said nothing at all on the subject, only went about her ledgers and her lessons, with the same unhurried steadiness she brought to everything in her narrow, careful life, refusing every invitation to join in the general mirth at a stranger's expense. It was this steadiness, so entirely unlike the performed liveliness of the young ladies he had spent an entire season fleeing in London, that Alistair found himself thinking of at odd and inconvenient hours, over his solitary breakfast at Ravenshire Hall, during dull committee meetings on drainage rights and tenant leases, in the last waking moments before sleep, when the great house around him grew so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat, and found it, for the first time in years, keeping company with a name rather than a worry. He returned to Ashcombe, under the name of Mr. Gray, with a frequency that even he privately acknowledged had ceased, sometime in the second week, to have anything whatsoever to do with his masons, who were, in point of fact, managing the East Wing's construction perfectly well without his daily supervision. He found reasons: a delivery of nails requiring his personal inspection, a question about the drainage of the North Field that could surely have waited a month, a walk that happened, each and every time, to pass beneath Whitmore's window at precisely the hour Eleanor took her tea upon the step outside, a book tucked always beneath her arm, her eyes lifting, more often than not, at the sound of his boots on the cobbles before she had even properly looked up. They spoke at first of small things: the price of wool that season, which had fallen considerably and troubled every farmer in the Vale; the vicar's tendency towards sermons of truly punishing length, which Eleanor bore with far more patience than Mr. Gray privately thought the sermons deserved; the particular stubbornness of Yorkshire weather, which seemed to take a personal and malicious pride in ruining every plan made without first consulting it. Then, by slow and entirely mutual degrees, of larger things, of books she had read by candlelight after her small pupils were safely put to bed, of a father she had lost to fever when she was but 12 years old, a loss she spoke of plainly and without self-pity, and of the modest, unglamorous courage it had taken to build a life afterward with nothing but her own 2 hands and a willingness to work harder than anyone thought a girl of her station strictly ought. "You do not ask me what I have," he observed once, as they walked together along the low stone wall above the vale, the light going long and gold across the heather, a pair of curlews calling somewhere in the distance. "Only what I think, and what I have read, and whether I found Mrs. Gaskell's latest novel as affecting as the reviews would have it. It is a rather novel experience, Miss Hartley, being asked such questions. Eleanor considered this with her usual unhurried care before answering, turning the thought over the way a careful housewife turns an egg to check it for cracks before trusting it to the pan. I have never found, she said at last, that a man's worth could be properly read from the cut of his coat, Mr. Gray. My own father wore a laborer's clothes his whole life through and was the finest man I have ever known, patient and honest, and never once cruel even when the world was cruel to him, which it was, more often than it ought to have been. I should think it a very poor sort of arithmetic indeed to value a soul by the state of its sleeves, when there is so very much more of a person to be read, if one only troubles to look. And what do you read in me? He asked, with more genuine curiosity than the question perhaps warranted from a man to a woman he had known scarcely a fortnight. She glanced at him sideways, a small private smile touching the corner of her mouth. I read a man who asks a great many questions of others, and answers very few himself. I do not press you on it, Mr. Gray. I imagine every soul is entitled to keep a room or two of the house locked, so long as the rest of it is honestly furnished. He did not tell her, then, that he was a duke. He told himself it was because the moment was not yet right, or because he feared, genuinely feared, with an anxiety that surprised him considerably in a man not generally given to fear of any kind, that the revelation would alter irrevocably the easy, unguarded honesty that had grown up between them like ivy finding its own quiet way up an old and previously bare wall. But in the private honesty he permitted himself only after dark, alone in his own great cold house, he knew the truer reason. He did not want, yet, to surrender the singular and entirely unfamiliar pleasure of being wanted for nothing grander than himself, a pleasure he suspected, correctly, he would never again experience once his name were known. Cordelia, meanwhile, pursued her own ambitions with entirely undiminished vigor, having set her cap that spring for Sir Reginald Ashby, a baronet of modest fortune and considerable self-regard, who had taken rooms in the neighboring town of Kirkley for the hunting season, and whose attentions she cultivated with a great deal of calculated charm and rather less genuine feeling. She spent her evenings composing letters designed to appear spontaneous and were in fact drafted and redrafted 3 times over, and privately despised the smallness of prospects that could be improved by nothing grander than a baronet's notice, never once suspecting, as she licked her envelopes shut and rehearsed her drawing-room laugh before her looking-glass each evening, that fate had already arranged for her a humiliation so complete and so public it would echo through 3 counties for years to come. The friendship between Eleanor and the man she believed to be Mr. Gray deepened through that Yorkshire spring in the manner of all things built to genuinely last, slowly, without ceremony or grand declaration, constructed of 100 small kindnesses rather than any single dramatic gesture, the way a stone wall is built not in a single afternoon, but course by patient course. He brought her books from London, claiming, with a straight face that cost him considerably more effort than he let show, that they had come cheap from a peddler passing through Kirkley. In truth, he had written to 3 separate booksellers in Piccadilly, at no small expense, and with a great deal of unnecessary urgency, to secure the precise edition of a novel she had once mentioned wanting, in the offhand and entirely unassuming way of a woman who did not expect to have such small wishes granted by anyone. She, in turn, mended the collar of his laborer's coat without being asked, her needle moving with the same unhurried competence she brought to her ledgers and her lessons alike, and left, folded once into his coat pocket, where he would find it hours later on the ride home in the fading light, a single pressed sprig of Yorkshire heather, with no note attached at all, because some things, she had come to feel, required no explanation between 2 people who had learned, almost without noticing, to understand each other, without one. It was Eleanor who taught him, entirely without meaning to teach him anything at all, that the whole careful architecture of his former life, the endless bowing, the flattery calibrated precisely to his rank rather than his person, the exhausting and unending management of what other people believed they ought to say to a duke rather than what they actually thought, had cost him something he had not fully understood he was losing, until she gave it back to him without ever knowing she had done so, the plain, unguarded pleasure of simply being known, wholly and without performance, by another human soul. "You look at me," he told her one evening, as the last light went copper over the moor, and the swallows wheeled low over the fields ahead of the coming dark, as though I were merely a man, with nothing more remarkable about me than any other man walking this earth. Do you have any notion how rare a gift that is, Miss Hartley? I have been looked at a very great many ways in my life. I do not believe I have ever, before you, simply been looked at. You are merely a man, Eleanor said, and smiled, a smile that transformed her whole plain, sensible face into something he found himself, with some genuine alarm, entirely unable to look away from, something that struck him as more beautiful than any diamond he had ever seen presented to him by a hopeful mother at a London ball. Whatever else you may also happen to be, Mr. Gray, I dare say every man carries some grandness or other hidden away somewhere in him, if one only has the patience to find it. I have simply chosen to look for the man first, and let the rest present itself in its own time, if it wishes to. There was, in that light and careless answer, rather more prophecy than either of them yet guessed, and he found himself, walking back to his waiting carriage that evening in the last of the light, laughing aloud at the sheer unlikeliness of it, that the truest words spoken to him in 4 years as Duke had come from a shopgirl who did not yet know she was speaking them to one. He began, in the weeks that followed, to write her letters, brief, unsigned but for a single initial, the letter G, left in places she would be certain to find them, tucked into the prayer book she kept at the small stone church at the edge of the village, slipped beneath the shop's back door on mornings when his duties in Leeds or York kept him from Ashcombe entirely, once even left folded inside a basket of eggs delivered from the Hall's own farm, to her considerable and delighted confusion. She kept every one of them, however slight, in a small wooden box that had belonged to her mother and had, until then, held nothing but a single lock of infant hair and a christening spoon, though she could not have said with any certainty, had she been asked directly, precisely what she hoped the letters meant, or where this quiet, careful courtship, for by now she understood it for exactly that, whatever its author chose to call it, was ultimately bound to lead her. Cordelia, entirely unaware of any of this, for Eleanor was not a woman given to sharing her private happinesses with a cousin who had shown herself capable of throwing water in a stranger's face for the crime of asking politely for tea, continued her small, careless cruelties toward the laborer whenever their paths happened to cross in the village. A cutting remark about the state of his boots, a pointed silence when he entered the shop, a laugh shared behind her hand with whichever companion happened to be at her side that particular afternoon. She mistook her own unkindness, throughout, for cleverness and consequence, a mark of her own superior discernment, never once imagining that the whole village would soon watch that cleverness unmade, publicly and entirely, in the space of a single golden morning she had not yet any notion was coming. It was in early June that business, real business, the tiresome, unglamorous machinery of a dukedom that could not, however much he might wish it otherwise, be conducted indefinitely from a Yorkshire building site, called Alistair, away from Ashcombe and back to London, where the season was reaching its full, suffocating flower, all heat and silk, and the particular exhaustion of a city determined to enjoy itself whether or not any individual within it actually was. He had not intended to think of Eleanor Hartley amid the crush of Mayfair drawing-rooms and the endless parade of eligible young ladies presented before him like prize cattle at a county fair, each with her accomplishments listed as carefully as a horse's bloodline, but he found, to his own considerable irritation, that he thought of little else. At a ball given by the Countess of Ashcroft, a glittering affair of 800 candles, an orchestra imported at ruinous and, in his private opinion, entirely unnecessary expense from Vienna, and a ballroom so crowded with silk and jewels that the whole room seemed to shimmer as though underwater, he stood at the edge of the dancing, in his proper evening dress, watching the whirl of calculated ambition disguised as gaiety, and felt more entirely alone than he had ever once felt standing soaked to the skin in the rain outside a Yorkshire provision shop. "You are wanted for the second quadrille, Ravenshire," murmured his old friend Lord Pelham, appearing at his elbow with a glass of champagne he had not requested and did not particularly want. "Lady Augusta has been asking after you these 20 minutes together, and her mother has positioned herself near the refreshment table with the tactical precision of Wellington surveying the field at Waterloo. I should not care to disappoint either of them, If I were you, the Dowager Countess has a memory like a millstone and grinds just as fine. I have a headache, Alistair said, which was not, strictly speaking, untrue, though its cause had considerably less to do with the heat of the ballroom than with the particular ache of being 300 miles from where he most wished to be. Pelham studied him with the shrewd and not unaffectionate amusement of a man who had known him since Eton, since scraped knees and shared Latin translations and every disaster of boyhood between. You've had this same headache at every ball this season, old friend, without a single exception that I have observed. One begins to suspect the affliction is not medical in nature at all, but geographical, and that its cure lies somewhere considerably north of here. Alistair said nothing to this, but his gaze drifted, unbidden and entirely against his own will, to the tall windows at the ballroom's edge, beyond which he could just make out the dark shapes of the garden below, and beyond that, in his mind's eye that would not be governed no matter how firmly he attempted it, the moor above Ashcombe under a grey Yorkshire sky, and a woman in a plain grey dress taking her tea upon a shop step, entirely unaware that a duke 300 miles distant was, at that precise moment, thinking of nothing else in all the world. Royal etiquette required that he dance twice more before the supper interval, and duty being duty, he performed the requirement without complaint, if also without any particular enthusiasm. Once with Lady Augusta Pembroke, whose mother's ambitions for the match were so transparent as to be almost admirable in their sheer, unblinking thoroughness, and once with the daughter of a visiting Prussian count, whose conversation consisted entirely of compliments, so polished and so evidently rehearsed that they might have been ordered wholesale from a catalogue of appropriate things to say to a duke. Both young ladies were, by any objective measure, accomplished and lovely. Lady Augusta played the pianoforte with genuine skill, and had opinions of her own on the corn laws, which was more than could be said of most of the room, and Alistair found himself, dancing through the practiced figures of the quadrille, entirely unable to recall a single word either of them had said to him, not 30 seconds after they had said it, his mind occupied instead with the memory of Eleanor's voice, low and steady, telling him that a man's worth could not be properly read from the cut of his coat. It was Lady Augusta herself, sharper and more perceptive than her mother's transparent ambitions gave her any credit for, who finally observed, midway through their dance, with a dry and not unkind amusement that suggested she had long ago made her peace with not being the one to secure his heart. "You are somewhere else entirely tonight, Your Grace. I do hope, wherever it is, the company is worth the distraction, because I promise you, it is very much worth more than anything on offer here." He had not answered her directly, only inclined his head in a manner that could have meant a great many things, and Lady Augusta, to her considerable credit, did not press further, only smiled a small, knowing smile, and let the matter rest between them, as something understood, without needing to be spoken aloud. But he had written to his steward the following morning, before he had even properly broken his fast, instructing that the works at Ravenshire Hall be given priority above all his other estate business scattered across 3 counties, and had returned north within the fortnight, sooner in truth than any reasonable accounting of drainage and masonry could possibly have required, a fact his steward noted, with the discreet and entirely wise silence of a man who had served the family long enough to know when not to ask questions. The ceremony for the opening of the new almshouse wing, the very construction that had first brought Mr. Gray, dripping and unrecognized, into Whitmore's shop the previous winter, was to be, by common and enthusiastic agreement of the whole county, the grandest event Ashcombe had witnessed in a generation. Lords and ladies came up from London for the occasion, their carriages crowding the narrow lanes for the better part of a week beforehand. The Bishop of Ripon himself was engaged to deliver the blessing, a considerable honor for so small a village. The village green had been strewn with early roses cut that very dawn by half the local children for a penny apiece, and bunting in the deep blue and gold of the Ravenshire colors hung from every lamp-post along the high street, snapping cheerfully in a wind that had, at last and mercifully, blown the winter's rain elsewhere. Cordelia, determined as ever to be noticed by whatever gentry the day might produce, and still nursing hopes of Sir Reginald Ashby's attention, had spent a fortnight's wages she could ill afford on a new bonnet trimmed with silk violets, and had secured herself, through some careful and not entirely honest maneuvering with the vicar's wife regarding a favor owed, a position near the very front of the assembled crowd, quite certain, in the particular vanity of the young and recently and publicly humiliated, that her fortunes were at last, and entirely deservedly in her own estimation, about to turn in her favor. They were about to turn, though not remotely in the direction she imagined, nor toward any fortune she would have chosen for herself. At 11 o'clock precisely, the church bells rang out across the vale in a great joyful clamor. The assembled crowd hushed in anticipation, and a carriage drawn by 4 matched greys, its polished panels bearing a coat of arms Cordelia did not immediately recognize, though something in her chest tightened unaccountably at the sight of it, came up the lane bearing a single occupant, whose bearing, the particular set of his shoulders, the unhurried gravity of his walk as he descended, a walk, she realized, with the first cold trickle of dawning horror she had seen 100 times before on a muddy Yorkshire lane, struck her, in that first confused instant, as somehow, impossibly, dreadfully familiar, though he was dressed now not in laborer's gray, but in a coat of the finest blue superfine, his cravat, tied with the understated perfection only the very best London valets ever achieved, a signet ring, catching the morning light on one hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the steward, his voice pitched and trained to carry across the whole of the green, His Grace, Alistair Vane, 7th Duke of Ravenshire. The crowd erupted into applause so immediate and so thunderous that it took Cordelia a full 3 seconds, 3 seconds in which her whole world quietly and irrevocably rearranged itself, to understand what her eyes had already, in some deeper and more honest part of her mind, understood at once and entire. She did not applaud. She could not, in fact, move at all, for the whole of her body had gone cold with a horror so complete and so total that it felt to her almost like drowning, like the floor of the world had simply opened beneath her new silk violet bonnet. For there, ascending the steps of the very almshouse his own considerable fortune had funded, from foundation stone to roof slate, standing now among earls and bishops, and the Bishop of Ripon himself, with the easy, unstudied authority of a man entirely and effortlessly accustomed to such exalted company, was the laborer she had drenched with a jug of flower water and called impudent before 11 witnesses and her own aunt in a village shop not 4 months past. Beside her, someone in the crowd, she never learned who, though she would spend a great many sleepless nights afterward trying to place the voice, whispered to a companion, in a voice pitched precisely loud enough to carry to every ear within 10 feet, "Is that not the laborer from Whitmore's, the one Miss Ashworth threw water upon, this past winter?" The whisper spread through the assembled crowd, with the speed and heat of fire through dry summer hedgerow, passed from ear to ear, growing with each retelling exactly as the original story had grown, until it seemed to Cordelia that the whole of the green, the whole of the county, the whole of the assembled British Empire itself had turned, as one single body, to regard her with open and delighted astonishment. She felt every eye that had witnessed her cruelty that rainy afternoon turn now, with evident and entirely unashamed delight, toward the glorious spectacle of her ruin, and understood, with a clarity that would haunt her for years, precisely what it felt like to be the subject of the very cruelty she had so carelessly dispensed to a stranger. On the steps of the almshouse, the Duke's gaze moved slowly across the sea of upturned, applauding faces, and found, not Cordelia, whose humiliation he did not trouble himself in that moment to seek out or savor, having far better things to occupy his attention, but Eleanor, standing quietly near the rear of the crowd in her plain gray dress and her modest straw bonnet, her eyes gone wide with a dawning understanding that struck him, even at that considerable distance, like a physical blow to the chest. "Mr. Gray," her lips shaped the words, though no sound reached him across the noise of the crowd and the ringing bells. He came down from the steps then, in full view of the assembled county, the Bishop of Ripon, and every lord and lady his family had known for generations, an act so contrary to every rule of royal and social etiquette governing such occasions, that the assembled nobility murmured audibly in genuine astonishment, for dukes did not, as a rule, abandon their own ceremonies mid-proceeding to cross a public green toward a shop assistant of no fortune and no family name, and made his way through the parting crowd, which drew back before him like water before a ship's prow, until he stood before her, removing his hat as he had done, months before, dripping and entirely unknown, in her uncle's provision shop. "Forgive me," he said, quietly enough that only she and those nearest could properly hear it above the murmuring, astonished crowd. I ought to have told you sooner, Eleanor, but I did not want you to love a duke. I wanted for once in the whole of my life to be loved simply as a man, and you gave me that gift, freely and without ever once asking what it might be worth to you, before I had even found the courage to ask for it. If this story has you hooked, this is exactly the moment to like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think happens next between Cordelia, Eleanor, and the Duke, and subscribe so you don't miss where this goes. Because friends, we are only just past the halfway mark, and there is a great deal more heartbreak and happiness yet ahead. Cordelia's apology, when at last mortification and her aunt's considerable and unrelenting pressure forced it from her 3 days later, was delivered in the Duke's own study at Ravenshire Hall, a room of dark oak panels and tall mullioned windows, lined floor to ceiling with books she suspected, correctly, that his Grace had actually read that seemed, to her shrinking and thoroughly humbled sense of her own smallness, to disapprove of her presence entirely, as though the very walls had heard the story already and formed their own private judgment of her. She stood before his desk with her eyes fixed upon the pattern of the Turkish carpet rather than upon his face, her new bonnet with its silk violets left, that morning, quite forgotten on her dressing table, as though some instinct had warned her it would be entirely the wrong thing to wear to such a reckoning. "I did not know," she said, her voice smaller than she had ever heard it, "who you were." "That," the Duke replied, not unkindly, for he was not by nature a cruel man, even to those who had wronged him, but entirely without the softening she had perhaps, in some small foolish corner of her heart, hoped for, was rather the whole of the difficulty, Miss Ashworth Vane. "You judged a man's worth before you troubled yourself to learn a single thing of his character, his circumstances, or his reasons for standing before you in the rain. Had I truly been the poor laborer you believed me to be, tell me honestly, would your cruelty have been the least degree less shameful for it? Would a man's poverty have made the water you threw any less cold, or your words any less unkind?" Cordelia had no answer to this that did not further and more completely indict her, and stood in silence for a long moment before offering the only honest words she had left. "No, your Grace, it would not." "Then I think you already know the lesson I might otherwise have labored to teach you," he said, and there was, beneath the formality, something almost gentle. "I will not seek to ruin you, Miss Ashworth Vane, whatever you may fear, but I would ask that you consider, going forward, that every soul you meet, however plain their coat, however small their station, carries within them a whole life you know nothing of, and deserves, at minimum, your civility until they have proven themselves unworthy of it." She left Ravenshire Hall that grim afternoon, with her pride considerably and permanently diminished, and, though she would not for worlds have admitted it aloud, even to her own reflection, the first true lesson of her young and carelessly fortunate life beginning, slowly and painfully, to take root somewhere beneath the wreckage of her vanity, a seed that would not fully flower for some months yet, and only after considerably more suffering than she yet suspected awaited her. For Alistair and Eleanor, meanwhile, the weeks that followed unfolded like the slow, sweet turning of a long-anticipated page. He called upon her now quite openly, his proper carriage, bearing the full ducal crest rather than traveling incognito to the crossroads, waiting outside Whitmore's shop for the whole village to see, while London society, 300 miles distant, buzzed with genuine and delicious astonishment at the news that the Duke of Ravenshire, pursued without success through 4 full seasons by the most eligible young ladies from Mayfair to Bath, each armed with fortune and connection and considerable charm, had lost his heart entirely to a governess of no fortune and no name worth mentioning in the Morning Post. A scandal, some called it, though never within Eleanor's hearing, and a romance, others called it, with rather more accuracy and considerably more warmth. He walked with her in the Hall's own gardens, where climbing roses older than any single title in England grew pale and fragrant against ancient grey stone, past sundials and reflecting pools his ancestors had commissioned in centuries past, and told her, without ornament or any of the practiced phrases he had once deployed so effortlessly and so emptily at Almack's, that he loved her, not the imagined woman a duchess ought to be, all polish and pedigree, but Eleanor precisely as she stood before him in the garden light, plainly dressed, quick of mind, entirely unimpressed by silk, carriages, or coats of arms, and entirely, wonderfully herself. I have been loved, or told I was loved, for my name and my rents the whole of my adult life, he told her, taking her hand in the dappled shade of an old apple tree that had stood in that garden since before his grandfather's time. You are the very first person who ever loved the man beneath both, before you knew there was a name or a rent to love alongside him. I loved a man who gave a shop girl a clean cloth's worth of gratitude, as though she had handed him a kingdom, Eleanor said softly, and asked after my thoughts on Mrs. Gaskell before he ever asked after my prospects. I do not think, Alistair, that I have ever loved a duke at all. I have only ever loved you. It seemed, that golden summer, with the roses in full bloom and the whole of Ashcombe murmuring its approval, that nothing in heaven or England could touch their happiness. Cordelia, however, watching now from the very margins of a village society that no longer troubled itself to invite her to anything of consequence, her hopes of Sir Reginald Ashby quietly and permanently extinguished the moment word of her disgrace reached Kirkley, felt her old vanity curdle slowly, over the course of that long and bitter summer, into something considerably darker and far more dangerous than mere wounded pride, a jealousy so total, so entirely consuming, that it frightened even her own reflection in the glass on the nights she could not sleep for the burning of it. It was whispered, that autumn, through the particular and merciless machinery of village gossip, that Miss Cordelia Ashworth Vane had accepted a position as companion to an elderly and reclusive aunt residing in the fashionable spa town of Harrogate, a retreat that sounded on its polished surface entirely respectable, the sort of quiet, dutiful occupation that might restore a fallen young woman's reputation by slow and patient degrees, and concealed, beneath that respectable surface, a purpose considerably less so. From the relative privacy and anonymity of Harrogate, at a comfortable remove from any suspicion that might otherwise attach itself to her in a village where everyone knew everyone's business, Cordelia began, with a patience and a cunning that surprised even herself, to unmake, piece by careful piece, the happiness she found she simply could not forgive Eleanor Hartley for possessing. She learned, through a long and circuitous chain of gossip, too petty and too tangled to trace to any single reliable source, a fact that Eleanor herself had never once troubled to conceal, but had also, in the ordinary quiet business of an ordinary and busy life, never yet found the natural occasion to mention to Alistair directly. That some 5 years before, Eleanor had taken into her own modest household her late sister Margaret's infant daughter, the child's father having vanished before the birth under circumstances no one in the village spoke of aloud, and the mother, Eleanor's own beloved elder sister, lost tragically to childbed fever within days of the birth, and that Eleanor had raised the girl, whom she called Grace, through her earliest and most fragile years, as tenderly and as completely as any mother might raise a child born entirely of her own body, asking for no credit and offering no complaint for the burden, which she had never once considered a burden at all, but simply love. Cordelia saw in this innocent and entirely honorable fact an opportunity, and seized it without the smallest flicker of mercy or hesitation, her wounded pride having, by this point, entirely overtaken whatever gentler instincts she might once have possessed. An anonymous letter arrived at Ravenshire Hall on a grey October morning, delivered by the ordinary post and giving no indication of its origin, written in a hand carefully and deliberately disguised, containing a smudged and thoroughly unflattering pencil sketch of Eleanor with a small girl clinging to her skirts, sketched by a hired and unscrupulous street artist in Harrogate, who asked no questions of his patron, and beneath it a single line calculated, with vicious and deliberate precision, to plant exactly the seed of doubt it was designed to plant in the heart of a man who had spent 4 long years learning, through painful and repeated experience, to distrust the motives of nearly everyone who smiled at him. Ask Miss Hartley whose child she truly hides, and why in all this time she has never once told you the truth of it. Alistair, who had trusted so entirely, so completely, so unguardedly for the first time in years, felt something cold and unfamiliar move through his chest as he read it standing alone in his study, the letter trembling very slightly in his hand. Not quite doubt, not yet, not in its full and settled form, but its long and creeping shadow, cast by every one of the 4 seasons in which he had learned, painfully and repeatedly, to distrust the smiling faces arrayed before him at every ball and every supper. He told himself the letter was nothing, the work of some jealous rival or malicious stranger with no true knowledge of Eleanor's character, and yet he found he could not entirely dismiss it, could not simply burn it and forget it as he knew, in his better judgment, he ought to have done. He said nothing to Eleanor of the letter directly, could not bring himself to speak the accusation aloud, even to ask her to deny it. He only grew quieter in her company over the following days, more careful, more distant in ways too subtle for her to name precisely, but too consistent and too sustained for her not to feel, the way one feels a change in weather before a single cloud has crossed the sun. And when she pressed him gently, more than once, with growing concern in her clear gray-green eyes, to know what troubled him so plainly and so uncharacteristically, he turned the conversation aside each time with a courtesy so exquisitely careful, so perfectly and coldly correct, that it felt, to her bewildered and increasingly wounded heart, like watching a door close by slow degrees, quietly, without slam or explanation, until at last it stood shut entirely, and she could not for the life of her say precisely when it had happened. Within a fortnight, without ever once asking her plainly for the truth, she would have given him freely and at once. Without a moment's hesitation, had he only troubled to ask it of her directly, he withdrew his suit entirely, sent word through his steward, in the coldest and most correct language a solicitor might have drafted, that his calls at Whitmore's shop would cease indefinitely, offering no explanation whatsoever, and left Eleanor to learn the whole of it second-hand, through village gossip grown suddenly and inexplicably and cruelly delighted around her, that the Duke of Ravenshire had lost his interest in her every bit as swiftly and as inexplicably as he had once, apparently, found it. Eleanor bore the wound in precisely the manner she bore every hardship life had ever set before her, quietly, without public complaint or dramatic scene, teaching her lessons and keeping her ledgers exactly as before, though those who knew her best, her aunt chief among them, could see plainly enough that some essential light had gone quietly out of her, the way a lamp gutters and dims in an unexpected draught one cannot quite trace to its source. She did not understand, in any way she could reason her way toward however many sleepless nights she devoted to the puzzle of it, what she had done to deserve so sudden and so total a withdrawal from a man who had, not 3 weeks before, knelt beside her among the roses and spoken of love as though it were the truest thing he had ever known. She wrote him a single letter, brief, dignified, asking plainly and without accusation what had changed between them, and whether she had in some way given offense she was not aware of, and received no reply whatsoever, for the letter never once reached him at all, intercepted before it ever left the village post by a housemaid at Ravenshire Hall who had been quietly and handsomely paid for precisely this service by an intermediary Cordelia had engaged in Harrogate, and burned in a kitchen grate before it could ever soften a heart Cordelia had labored so patiently and so cruelly to harden against the truth. Alistair, for his own part, was no happier in his self-imposed and entirely unnecessary isolation. He told himself, in the long and increasingly sleepless nights that followed, pacing the length of his study until the small hours, that he had done the only sensible thing available to a man in his position, that a duke could not, in good conscience, marry a woman with secrets left unexplained, that trust once shaken could not simply be willed back into being by wishing it so, however much he might wish otherwise. But sensible thoughts, he discovered with some considerable private bitterness, made exceedingly poor company at 3 in the morning, when the great house stood silent around him, and there was no one to distract him from the plain and growing conviction that he had made some terrible, irrevocable error. He slept little and smiled less, as October gave way to a bleak and early November, until his own household staff began to whisper, below stairs where such things were always whispered first, that his Grace had become a stranger to himself, a shadow of the man who had returned from Yorkshire, that spring so unaccountably lighter than they had ever seen him. It was, in the end, his own grandmother, the formidable Dowager Duchess of Ravenshire, a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlived every fashion she had ever scorned, and who had come north for a fortnight's visit, precisely because she had heard, through her own considerable network of correspondence, that something was amiss with her grandson, who at last forced the whole matter into unforgiving daylight, over a supper he had, as had become his habit, barely touched. "You have not asked her," the old woman observed, setting down her fork with a small, deliberate click of silver against china, her sharp dark eyes fixed upon her grandson, with the particular ruthlessness reserved only for those she loved best and could not bear to watch destroy their own happiness. I have watched you push that lamb about your plate for the better part of 20 minutes, Alistair, and in all that time you have said perhaps 6 words to me, none of them of any consequence. You, who prided yourself so thoroughly, so tediously, on being loved honestly for once, in your privileged and rather foolish life, could not extend that very same honesty to her when it was required of you. You judged that girl unheard and unasked, Alistair, precisely, I might observe, as that vain little creature in Harrogate judged you, unheard and unasked, in her uncle's shop last winter. Have you truly learned nothing at all from your own humiliation, or did you only enjoy being the wounded party, and find you have rather less appetite for being the one who might have wounded another? I have my reasons, grandmother. I dare say you do. Men of your rank generally do, and generally they are excellent reasons for behaving like a coward, while telling yourself you are behaving like a gentleman. What is her crime, precisely? Do share it with me, since you have clearly given it a great deal more consideration than you have given her the courtesy of a single honest question. He told her then of the letter, of the sketch, of the child clinging to Eleanor's skirts in a drawing he had not been able to look at twice. The Dowager Duchess was silent for a long moment, studying her grandson with an expression he could not entirely read. And in all the months you spent walking that moor with her, talking to her of books and fathers and God knows what else you have never once troubled to discuss with me, did she strike you, even once, as a woman capable of deceit, of hiding some shameful secret behind those very steady eyes you have described to me at such tedious length these past months? No, he admitted, quietly, never once. Then I put it to you, Alistair, that you did not act on evidence. You acted on fear. The fear of every man who has been flattered and courted and calculated over his whole life, that the one honest thing he found might, after all, turn out to be false like all the rest. But fear is not evidence, my dear boy, and a duke who cannot tell the difference between the two is not fit to hold the title, whatever the law of inheritance might say on the matter. The words struck him with a force considerably colder than the jug of water Cordelia had once emptied over his head in a Yorkshire shop, and he understood, in the particular clarity that arrives only alongside genuine and total shame, precisely and completely what he had allowed himself to become in the space of a single anonymous letter, a man who had judged as swiftly and as unfairly as the very world that had once so wounded him. He rode for Ashcombe before the sun had properly risen the following morning, leaving his grandmother to finish her breakfast alone with the quiet, satisfied air of a woman who had said exactly what needed saying. He found Eleanor in the small stone church at the edge of the village, sitting alone in the thin gray light of a November afternoon, the church otherwise empty and cold. Little Grace, her sister's daughter, whom she had raised these 5 years past with the same quiet, unwavering devotion she brought to every soul entrusted to her care. Asleep against her shoulder, one small fist curled loosely against the fabric of her aunt's plain dress, entirely oblivious to the storm that had gathered and nearly broken above her small head. "Tell me the truth," he said, breathless from the hard ride, snow beginning to fall thin and silent through the church's open door behind him, dusting his shoulders and the stone floor alike. "And I swear before God and this church that I will believe every single word of it, whatever shame it costs me for not having asked you sooner, for not having trusted you, when trust was the very least I owed you." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he feared, genuinely and completely, standing there dripping melted snow onto the ancient flagstones, that he had lost the whole of her forgiveness, along with the whole of her trust, that some things once broken could not be mended however earnestly one wished it. Before she spoke at last, her voice low and steady, even as tears stood plainly and unashamed in her clear gray-green eyes. "Her name is Grace," she said softly, drawing the sleeping child a fraction closer against her, as though some instinct urged her to shield the girl even from the sound of the conversation, though Grace slept on undisturbed. "My sister Margaret died bringing her into this world, Alistair, 5 years ago this very winter, and there was no one else living who could or would raise her. Our own mother long dead, our father gone before that, and Margaret's husband vanished before the child was even born. May God forgive him for it, though I have long since given up hoping he will trouble himself with such a small matter as one man's cowardice. And so I have loved her as my own from the very hour of her birth, because there was no other honest choice available to me, and because I loved her the moment I first held her, red-faced and screaming, in my own two arms, and knew I would burn the whole world down before I let any harm come to her. I never once hid her existence from you, Alistair. I never once thought to hide her, because I have never once been ashamed of her, not for a single moment of these 5 years. I simply never yet found the natural moment in which to tell you of her. We spoke, always, of books and weather and my father, and somehow the conversation never once turned toward her, and I did not think to force it, believing, foolishly perhaps, that there would be time enough for it, that whatever this was growing between us would allow for such ordinary revelations in its own good time. And you never gave me the chance to find that moment before you vanished from my life entirely, without so much as a single word of explanation, leaving me to learn from strangers in the market that I had somehow, in your eyes, become unworthy of even a farewell. He crossed the cold stone floor of the church and knelt before her, a duke of the realm, kneeling on unforgiving stone before a shop girl turned governess and a sleeping child, not even her own by blood. In a village church that had seen a great many confessions in its long centuries, but perhaps none quite so complete, and said, his composed and careful voice finally, entirely breaking on every single word, I judged you unheard, exactly as the whole of society once judged me unheard, in a shop, on a rainy afternoon that I have thought of every single day since, that changed the whole course of my life, though neither of us knew it at the time. I am ashamed, Eleanor. I am ashamed of my doubt, and ashamed of my silence, and ashamed most of all that I let a stranger's cruelty, delivered anonymously, and without courage enough to sign its own name, mean more to me in a single moment than 5 months of knowing your true character. And I love you. I have loved you, I think, since the very moment you handed a stranger a clean cloth and asked nothing of him in return but his good opinion, which he would have given you 1,000 times over even then, had he only known how to say so. And I will spend whatever years you are willing to allow me proving to you, every single day of them, that I have learned, at last and for good, to do better. Grace stirred against her aunt's shoulder at the sound of his voice, blinking awake, and regarded the strange man kneeling on the church floor with the frank, unblinking curiosity only a small child can properly manage. Are you sad? She asked him, with the direct simplicity of a 5-year-old encountering adult grief for the first time. I was, very sad indeed, Alistair told her, with perfect seriousness, as though she were the most important person in the room, which, in that moment, she rather was. But I think I am about to be very happy instead, if your aunt will allow it. Eleanor, through tears that had finally begun to fall in earnest, laughed. A small, watery, entirely unguarded sound that was, to Alistair's ears, the sweetest thing he had heard in the whole of that long and terrible autumn. I believe, she said, that I might allow it, Your Grace, on the condition that you never again mistake silence for an answer, whatever letters may come to trouble you. Never again, he promised, not so long as I live. Before we get to the ending, if this story has moved you even a little, and I hope it has, this is the perfect time to like this video, drop a comment telling me your favorite line so far, and subscribe for more stories just like it. Now, let's finish this one properly. Forgiveness, when it came slowly and honestly, as all forgiveness genuinely worth the having always must, built not in a single dramatic scene, but in the quiet accumulation of ordinary days. Eleanor did not pretend, in the weeks that followed, that the wound of his sudden and unexplained withdrawal had not cut deep, and Alistair did not once pretend that his own fault in the matter had been a small one, easily forgiven and more easily forgotten. But across that long, quiet winter, as the snow settled over the moor and the fires burned late in both the hall and the small cottage where Eleanor and Grace made their home, he set about proving himself in the only currency Eleanor had ever truly valued. Not diamonds, not carriages emblazoned with a ducal crest, but patience, steady presence, and 1,000 small honesties freely and consistently given, day after ordinary day, until trust, like the ivy on the garden wall, began once more its slow and steady climb. He came to her cottage each week without fail, rain or snow or the particular bitter wind that swept down off the moor in January, and sat with her by the fire, and ask after Grace's lessons with a genuine and growing interest that had nothing whatsoever to do with performance. Learning the girl's favorite stories and her particular fondness for the small gray cat that lived in the cottage's woodshed, until Grace herself began, without prompting from anyone, to run to greet him at the door each time his carriage was heard on the lane, calling him not your Grace, but simply Alistair, a familiarity Eleanor gently corrected, and he privately, entirely, encouraged. He settled upon Eleanor and young Grace a handsome stone cottage on the quieter edge of the Ravenshire estate, offered not as payment for a wrong he understood he could never fully undo, whatever gestures he might make toward it, but as a home, chosen with genuine and considerable care for her particular comforts. A walled garden where Grace might grow and play in safety, a small library stocked with precisely the books Eleanor had once mentioned wanting and never expected to own, tall windows that looked out over the very moor she had always loved best, even in its harshest weather. He sought and received Mr. Whitmore's blessing, offered with rather more good humor than resentment at losing his best shop assistant, to release Eleanor entirely from her position at the counter, and secured for her instead, through his own patronage, and with considerable input from Eleanor herself as to how it ought properly to be run, a position overseeing the education of the estate's tenant children, work she had quietly longed for the whole of her adult life, teaching not merely her letters and sums, but a genuine love of learning to children who had never before been offered the chance, and had never once dared to hope she might actually have such a position offered to her. Word of Cordelia's letters, and of the housemaid bribed to intercept Eleanor's own correspondence, reached him not long afterward, traced at last to Harrogate through the diligent and thorough inquiries of his steward, who had grown suspicious of the housemaid's sudden and unexplained new bonnet, and had, with the patient thoroughness of a man well trained in estate management, followed the thread to its source. He did not seek any public vengeance against Cordelia, for that was never his nature, and he had, moreover, no wish to cause her aunt, an entirely innocent party, any further embarrassment in a village she had lived in her whole life. But he made certain, quietly and completely, through channels no respectable drawing room in 3 counties would ever think to question or trace back to their true source, that Miss Cordelia Ashworth Vane would not soon find herself received in any household of consequence again, north or south, and Cordelia, learning at last, in genuine and lasting solitude, the true and considerable cost of pride left entirely unchecked, retreated from society altogether that winter, taking a small position as a paid companion to a genuinely elderly and genuinely difficult woman in a genuinely unfashionable corner of Harrogate, to reflect, at long and painful leisure, upon the lessons she had been so very many months, and so much needless and gratuitous cruelty toward others, in finally learning. The wedding of His Grace the Duke of Ravenshire to Miss Eleanor Hartley took place the following spring, in the very same small stone church where he had once knelt before her in shame beneath a fall of silent November snow, now dressed instead in all the plain and joyful colors of a proper Yorkshire wedding, early roses banked upon the altar and along every pew end, the whole of Ashcombe crowded into a building built for scarcely half their number, farmers and their wives standing shoulder to shoulder with the earls and countesses who had traveled up from London for the occasion, united for one bright spring morning by a single shared happiness that recognized no distinction of rank. Little Grace, now 6 years old, and entrusted with a sacred and solemn duty she performed, with the ferocious concentration only a small child can properly muster, scattered rose petals down the aisle ahead of the bride, pausing once, halfway down, to make quite certain everyone had noticed how well she was doing it. Eleanor wore no diamonds that day, though the Dowager Duchess had offered, with genuine warmth, the whole of the Ravenshire jewels for her use. She had asked for none, and Alistair, who had by now learned precisely and completely what she valued above all the treasures his considerable fortune could purchase, gave her instead a single ring set with one small unpolished piece of Yorkshire stone cut from the very quarry that had built the almshouse wing where they had first, entirely unknowingly, begun to fall in love on a rain-soaked afternoon neither of them would ever, for the whole rest of their lives together, forget. "You once told me," he said, as they stood together before the altar, the whole village and half the peerage of England holding its collective breath, that you would judge no man by the cut of his coat. I have worn a laborer's gray before you, Eleanor Hartley, and I have worn a duke's finest silk before you, and in 5 long months and 1 very foolish, very cold autumn, you loved the very same man beneath both, without ever once wavering in the truth of what you saw. I do not believe there is a finer gift one soul has ever given another in the whole long history of this world, and I do not believe I shall ever, for the rest of my days, deserve it half so much as I intend to try. There is one finer, she answered, smiling through tears she made no attempt whatsoever to hide, in front of the whole assembled county. And that is the chance I have now been given to love you back, for however many years remain to either of us, as a man first, always, whatever grand titles the world insists on hanging about your shoulders. Outside the church, as the bells rang joyfully out across the whole of the vale, and the assembled village raised its collective voice in celebration loud enough to carry to the farthest fold of the moor, a single solitary carriage passed along the distant road below the hill, its lone occupant, a woman dressed in traveling black, thinner and quieter than she had once been, who paused only a moment at the crest of the hill to watch, from a great and now permanent distance, the celebration she was no longer welcome to join, before drawing the carriage curtain firmly closed and continuing on, entirely alone, toward whatever narrow and diminished life her own unchecked pride had finally and irrevocably purchased for her. The Duke of Ravenshire took his new wife's hand in his, and together, no longer a duke and a governess, no longer a disguise and its discovery, no longer even a wound and its healing, but simply, at long last, 2 honest hearts that had found each other honestly and meant now to keep each other so for the whole remainder of their lives. They walked out together into the golden Yorkshire light, past every bowing tenant and every beaming villager, past the Dowager Duchess dabbing quite unashamedly at her eyes, past little Grace running ahead of them both with her basket now entirely empty of petals and her small face alight with a joy that needed no further explanation. The bells rang on across the vale, and did not stop for a very long while. The moor stretched gold and endless behind them, all the way to the horizon, exactly as it had on the first afternoon. A laborer in a gray coat walked in out of the rain seeking nothing more than a cup of tea. And somewhere beyond the last far hill, the sun set slowly and gloriously on the happiest day Ravenshire had ever known, while somewhere ahead of them, unseen but entirely certain, a lifetime of ordinary, extraordinary happiness was only just beginning, the first of many thousand golden days neither of them would ever again take for granted. And so the Duke, who once stood dripping and unknown in a Yorkshire shop, found, in the end, exactly what no title, no fortune, and no coat of the finest superfine could ever have bought him on its own, a love that saw him before it ever once knew his name, and that loved him still, more fiercely than ever, once it did. If this story warmed your heart the way it warmed mine in the telling, do me one last favor. Hit like, leave a comment telling me your favorite moment, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.